dig into this, and we're going to do a spoiler review for The Northman, the newest film from Robert Eggers. For those who don't know who Robert Eggers is, he's one of the best directors, I think, working today, directors working today in cinema, in film. And the reason I think that is just because he has made some of the most unique historical period pieces that we've seen in a very long time, over the past, 6-7 years. It all started in, I think, 2015 with a film called The Witch that came out. It starred Anya Taylor-Joy, who's in this film as well, and it was a very dark, grim 1600s period piece that takes place during the Puritan era of the United States, before they were the United States. And, it's a really dark, grim, eerie film that if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. It is really creepy and eerie. I mean, it's one of those horror films that doesn't really go for the cheap scares and doesn't really go for the jumps and the like I said, the cheap scares and the cheap jump moments, the jump scares. It doesn't really go for that kind of vibe. It's very much about atmosphere, very much about this dark environment that these evil spirits and omens are kind of enveloping, and you have this family that's trying to weather it all after being exiled from their community. So I mean, that film, I loved it. It was one of my favorite horror films of the 2010s. It made you think. It made you really feel uncomfortable. It scared me at times. I mean, it's just a really brilliant film, and really well acted. The dialogue was what really stood out to me because it was very much of the time. You could tell that Eggers did a lot of research on how these people actually spoke, how they wrote, how they actually talked, so that he could really mimic that in the dialogue. And obviously that plays in the other two films as well that he made, and including the one we're going to talk about here, The Northman. But also in 2019, just a few years later, Eggers came out with a film that was incredibly unique and got a little bit more attention than I think The Witch did, and that is a film called The Lighthouse. A lot of people have loved this film. They've been raving about it, and I remember seeing it when it came out. I saw it in the theater when it came out because I was such a fan of The Witch, and man, The Lighthouse is quite the film, man. It is. I think it's a little bit more entertaining than The Witch is in terms of things going on, but it is very weird, very esoteric, just like The Witch is. I think even more so. There's a lot of visual storytelling, a lot of imagery of folklore, and that was something obviously that played into The Witch too, was the deep folklore of the time period. And that's something that I love about Eggers as well, is that he really does a great job of capturing the folklore and the belief system of the time periods. It's never just about a certain story or a certain thing. It's very much, ingrained in the time that it's set in, and everything from the costumes to the sets and all of that. And that is very much the case in The Lighthouse as well, with Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe, who are stranded on this island and have to work, this lighthouse essentially, and they're isolated and basically have to, Pattinson's character basically just has to work, all day, every day, just to keep the lighthouse going. And then there's some sort of weird spiritual energy coming from inside of the lighthouse that that Dafoe and Robert Pattinson's character both, slowly want to learn more about. And it kind of leaves you wondering as the viewer, what is this all about? And obviously you can dig into the history and the context of it, and that's the thing with Eggers films. I think a lot of people have really enjoyed, is the fact that they can go and actually dig into a lot of the lore and a lot of the religion and the imagery and the folklore and all of these different things. They all kind of come together when you start digging on your own, and you can learn a lot about that time period. But these films are almost just like a little snapshot of them. And that's where we get into today's film that just came out this past weekend. It is The Northman. This is an epic Viking film that takes place, I think, in like the early 1000s. You know, I don't know the exact year that this takes place, but, you know, it's during that time period of the Viking, Nordic people, I guess is the best way to say that. And it basically, you know, chronicles, well, we'll get into it, but yeah, this film was really interesting, and I'll give, you know, these are all non-spoiler thoughts here, so I'll get into it, but I really liked about this film, just giving my non-spoiler thoughts before we get into the spoiler review, I really liked about this film was just how it's probably the most palatable of the three films that Robert Eggers has made so far. You know, that, like I mentioned with The Witch, that film is just, it's very slow. It's a very slow burn, but it pays off, especially towards the end as stuff starts going crazy. And The Lighthouse is a little too wacky, I think, for a lot of people to really, you know, get into. But actually, I watched that film with my friends, my college roommates, and they really liked it. So even though it is a little wacky and weird, I think there's still a lot to like, and there's amazing dialogue and monologues in that film that really help add to the entertainment value and the chemistry between Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. But I think this film is probably the most palatable of the three because there's a lot of action, a lot of it's a pretty straightforward story. You know, it's a story we've seen before. You know, it's a revenge tale about, you know, a son avenging the murder of his father, and you know, we've seen that done in a lot of films, and I have no problem with telling the same story again, you know, that we've seen before, as long as the execution is there. And as long as it's different enough in the nuances. And this film definitely is, you know, like that's the thing, you know, a lot of people, even for like James Cameron's Avatar, for example, like a lot of people don't like that film because it's very derivative of that, you know, same kind of story of, you know, one population coming into another's homeland and ravaging it for some sort of, you know, MacGuffin resource of some sort. And then, you know, one individual from that, you know, invading party, you know, ends up sympathizing with the, you know, home tribe. And then, you know, from there, you know, I'm sorry, I was checking the stream, you know, but then from there, you know, he's able to kind of help uproot his own people's invasion to help save the people that he's kind of sympathizing with. You know, what I mean, we've seen that before in other films, you know, Dances with Wolves and Pocahontas and go down the list. So like the problem with Avatar that I have compared to this film, the reason I'm bringing it up is just because that film just didn't do enough for me in terms of its lore to really stand out. And I felt like it cut a lot of corners when it came to how it actually presented that story. So like, I don't even think it being derivative is as much of a problem for me as it is just being different in the nuances of the characters and the stories and the dialogue and all of that. And with this film, The Northman, I think it does a great job of really separating itself from a lot of the revenge films that we've seen, a lot of the redemption films that we've seen in the past. The performances are all really good. I do think this is probably the weakest in terms of dialogue of the three films, in my opinion. There is still some great, you know, monologues from some of these characters and whatnot, but I do think dialogue-wise, it's probably the weakest of the three. And then look, that's not saying, I mean, that's not saying too much, because is it not saying too much or saying too much? Who cares? But that's not that big of a deal because the other two films are brilliantly written, especially the Lighthouse. I mean, the dialogue in that film is off the chain. So it's like the fact that this film kind of, I wouldn't even say it falls short, but it's just probably the least dense of the three is fine because it makes up for it in other areas. I mean, the action in this film is great, and it's awesome to see Robert Eggers direct action. We haven't really seen him do that before. And especially with some of these big set pieces in this film, you know, there's raids and battles and one-on-one fights throughout this film, and a lot of gore and violence. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't pull punches, which I appreciate, especially for a film that takes place in this period, because it's a very hard period with a lot of violence, and it's a very much a kill or be killed time period where people just didn't put up with anything. You know, it was very much like, you know, one group comes in, another group comes in, they both want the same thing, then they fight to the death over it. It's kind of like that, you know? So it's like, there was not a lot. It was not a time of diplomacy, especially with the Viking people. They were very much, kill or be killed. We're gonna take this, kind of mentality. So, I think this film really did a great job of showing that hard boiled attitude that these people had of the time period. And I think the story, without going into too much detail right now, I think the story really did a good job of kind of keeping you guessing. I mean, you knew where it was going to go and how things were going to end, but I think it did a good job of kind of keeping you guessing throughout the middle of it. And there is, some twists and some moments that I didn't see coming that I really appreciated, which also helped put this above many of the other revenge films we've seen recently. So yeah, I really like this film, and I think you should check it out. Leaving the non-spoiler thoughts here, I think you should really check this film out. It's really good. It's well written. The action is well directed. The acting is great. Nicole Kidman's great in this film. Ethan Hawke is good in the small role he's in. Alexander Skarsgård probably gives arguably the best performance of his career. He's great in this film, and really has to carry a lot of this film. Even Willem Dafoe is good in a small role. So, I mean, it's a really good ensemble. But again, kind of my one complaint with the film and why it probably isn't as great as it could have been is just because I think the villain could have been fleshed out a little bit more. The villains in this film could have, without spoiling, could have been fleshed out a little bit more. And I'll talk about this obviously when we get into spoilers, but I kind of wish that there was a little bit more fleshing from those two characters to really kind of round out the backstory. And I mean, maybe that would arguably compromise the reveal that happens in the film, but I don't think it would, just because, nobody saw it coming anyway. So like when it comes, it could have been a little bit more earned. That's the only real complaint I have. And it is kind of a solid complaint because it has such a pivotal part in the story. And that's what keeps this film from being a perfect film, in my opinion. But I definitely think there's a lot to love here. They really do a good job of diving into the esoteric pagan religions of the time. And again, they don't hold back. There's a lot of violence, a lot of gore, a lot of really dark imagery. So, I mean, this isn't going to be for everybody per se, but I think if you like historical films that are historically accurate when they try to be, I mean, there's definitely, I think it is pretty historically accurate, but I think, and obviously I'm not an expert on Viking history, but I can say, it does look the part, but I do think there's definitely some scenes in here similar to the Lighthouse where it goes on these kind of esoteric dream sequences that happen, but they do have a purpose in this film. So I will say, I like that about it, that it really kind of, and the religion of the Viking people is very much, was very important to their existence. I mean, their whole structure of how the world worked and their gods and all of that was very important. So yeah, really liked it. And that's my spoiler-free thoughts.